All right, everybody, let's get started. Good afternoon, welcome. Give everybody a few seconds to find their seats. So thank you for coming today to our staff workshop on the definition of protected water. And our information items for today, just to give you the lay of the land, in case you hear an alarm, it is not my understanding there's no drills this afternoon. However, there have been drills recently. So if you do hear an alarm, we take the stairs down through the lobby and go over to Cesar Chavez Park. And more importantly, the restrooms are in the hall. Men's room to my left, ladies to the right. We're also being webcast today, and that the video of this webcast will be made available on our website probably in a week or so. If the people that are online, if you could send any questions that you may have or comments that maybe the people are yelling into the microphones, that type of thing, that would be appreciated. And we have folks that are monitoring the emails. So we've estimated the workshop to last about 3 hours. Maybe we could end sooner. If we have to go longer, so be it. I also want to let people know that if you have a comment you'd like to make, there's a set of cards over there by the sign-in. And if you're ready to make a blue card there. And so if you have a card filled out, our staff will come around and collect those. So at the end, the last part of the agenda will be public comment. So why are we here today? As you all know, mostly, that groundwater monitoring is required in areas where there's protected water. And of course, this is related to, we've got some amazing dynamic animations that staff did to give you a little depiction of an example cross-section there. But the definition is related to the work that we're doing under Senate Bill 4, the water with less than 10,000 milligrams per liter total dissolved solids and is located outside of an exempted aquifer. And today we're here because SB 4 required that we review the definition. So here we are. Our intended outcome of today's workshop is that, just to remind everybody, this is the first step, so providing a public forum to get your feedback. No decisions will be made today at this workshop, so this staff workshop. Also, if any changes are proposed in the future, a public process will be followed. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Karen Kramer, who will introduce the speakers for today. Thank you.
I'm Karen Kramer. I'm the unit chief for our oil and gas monitoring unit here at the State Water Board. So our first speaker will be Bob Poole with the Western States Petroleum Association. Bob is the director of production, state, and coastal issues, and Bob will say a few words about the first two presenters that we have. Thank you, Bob.
Well, first off, thanks for the opportunity, and I'm kind of here representing both WISPA and SIPA, two of our primary industry associations that deal with the upstream production side of our business. And I'm really glad to introduce both Dan Tormey and Peter Zawislansky. Dan, I believe, is on the agenda first. And I wanted to give you a couple of, their bios are in the background, but I wanted to give you a couple of informational pieces on them to set the stage, because these guys are pretty heavy hitters in the field, and wanted to, really excited about their contribution to this exchange. So Dan Tormey, sitting right here, is a PhD and is a petroleum geologist. He's with Catalyst Environmental Solutions, and Dr. Tormey has more than 20 years of experience as a geologist, geochemist, and engineer. And he is an expert in energy, water resources, and land management, and he conducts environmental reviews for both government and industry. He's advised the state already on key issues in oil and gas, including the steering committee for CCST, the California Council of Science and Technology well stimulation study pursuant to SB4. And I had the pleasure to tour with him on the SB 83 panel that he serves on. My boss serves on that as well, on underground injection control review. He's also been on the California State Assembly panel on offshore hydraulic fracturing, the California Select Committee on Ocean Protection, and SB 1281, the California Council of Science and Technology Assessment of Oil and Gas Water Cycle Reporting in California. He's a peer reviewer there. And he's also the 2018 SPE recipient of the Environmental Safety and Corporate Social Responsibility Award. And Dan holds a bachelor's in civil engineering and geology from Stanford and a PhD in geology and geochemistry from MIT. Whoa. That's it. Also, I want to then introduce Peter. Peter will be speaking on behalf of WISPA. It's kind of a tandem effort here. And Peter has 30 years of experience in site characterization, remediation, project management, and agency interaction. He supported WISPA in the development of groundwater monitoring strategies in conformance with Senate Bill 4. And it's related to well stimulation, obviously, and prepared and presented formal public forum presentations on the topic. Mr. Zawazlansky, Peter, has authored or co-authored 12 peer-reviewed journal articles, 3 book chapters, and many preceding papers. He's also served as a peer reviewer for top-tier scientific journals and the Cal Fed program. So first have Dan come up, and then Peter will follow. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Hi, Brianna. I didn't see you come in. Let's see, so I wanted to start by kind of a general view that the oil and gas industry has been through a thorough review and validation of practices and conditions in the 4 years since the CCST SB4 report was issued. I was on the steering committee for that report, along with my friend Seth Shonkoff sitting there, and we were part of a summary report that all the steering committee members were involved with the writing of, and it was a consensus document. There were no dissenting reports or anything like that. And that effort kicked off a lot of very focused studies in the oil and gas industry, one of which is what we're talking about today, looking at the criteria for groundwater monitoring, and specifically today, the definition of protected waters. I wanted to point out, because it's likely going to come up in our discussions, that this isn't the only outcome of the CCST study. The underground injection control program has also been revised and updated, and in particular, that included a complete reevaluation of the exemption of certain water-bearing zones into which produced water was injected. This is known as the aquifer exemption process, and I'll be talking about that a little later in my remarks. Operators were required to sample the water in the zone to determine chemical composition, to conduct thorough structural and hydrogeological studies to verify zonal isolation, that the injected water stays in the zone, and hydraulic control, that the injected water doesn't pose a threat to beneficial uses. And then finally, to verify there's no current beneficial uses identified in these deep zones. And so this process of looking at aquifer exemptions included DOGGR, the state and regional boards, EPA, the public. They were well done. I'm currently serving on the state panel, participating in the review of the new UIC regulations in parallel with a federal review by the EPA contractor, the Groundwater Protection Council. And there's a lot of, as you'll see, there's a lot of overlap, I believe, between these two efforts. Another CCST outcome is the state board's food safety panel, evaluating the beneficial reuse of produced water for agriculture. Another program, which I just completed a peer review of, is the SB 1281 program looking at oil and gas produced water cycle reporting, another deeper dive into current practices in order to ensure that the key steps in the produced water process are transparent and subject to public review. And there's others as well, but to me, these are the ones that appeared most relevant for our workshop today, so I'm kind of teeing them up now. And really the reason I took you through all that is to demonstrate that where we are now is a state of a firm, modern regulatory oversight regime that's been validated with current practices, and it's provided for more thorough review and analysis. So in my remarks, I'll give you a spoiler right now. I'm going to be generally advocating to keep the definition of protected waters as it is now. And, I'm trying to communicate here that by the same, keep it the same, I mean as part of this, bright, shiny new regulatory regime that we have with validation, regulatory oversight, and by the same, I don't mean the 70s. So just a general overall caveat there. Okay, don't bother reading the federal definition. The next speaker is going to be going in more there. It's more of a prop. So to the matter at hand, the definition of produced water. So, if you Google, the definition of protected waters. If you Google protected water, one of the first things that come up is the Coast Guard definition of marinas and areas with man-made protections against swells and tides. Protected itself has a lot of nuances. So, definitions are really important. In the groundwater monitoring for well stimulation world, protected water means water that has less than 10,000 parts per million total dissolved solids. This is derived from the EPA Safe Drinking Water Act UIC provisions, which define this level as a potential underground source of drinking water. And it's used in the UIC process for the purposes of defining the zones that must be cased off by oil and gas injection wells or Class 2 injection wells. So this definition is different than the California's Porter Cologne definition of sources of drinking water, which sets 3,000 parts per million TDS as the standard. The EPA definitions, the 10,000, the California definitions, 3,000, they're both right because they're looking at different attributes and different applications. But I can tell you, from an industry standpoint, this 10,000 versus 3,000 thing really led to a lot of initial confusion on the part of operators. What are we talking about in terms of protecting sources of drinking water? And so as far as today's workshop goes, I think the key point is that the EPA definition is far more inclusive in terms of the volumes of water, groundwater, that would be considered protected water. 10,000 parts per million is a much larger volume than 3,000. So the protected water definition for this monitoring is conservative in that it considers more water to be protected. Another aspect on this slide is that federal exemption criteria definition, and the definition of protected water specifies waters outside an exempt aquifer are not subject to monitoring, or are subject to monitoring. So the focus of that federal definition is on sources of drinking water. For my remarks today, I'm going to look at exemption in the context of UIC and aquifer exemption process that's nearing completion now. And I don't think that let me back up a little bit. So that aquifer exemption process, both in general in reference to this multi-year intense comprehensive review to gain exempt status was that was a heavy lift both by industry and the agencies. And to turn around today, although, as John said, no decisions are going to be made today, but to turn around in the near future and say, those aquifer exemptions, those don't matter anymore, I think that would be hard to support, in my opinion. Okay. So my first recommendation here is to keep the definition focused on this particular context of SB4 groundwater monitoring. Having the tie to the definition of the UIC program keeps it consistent with the Safe Drinking Water Act definitions, but that they only apply to this monitoring program we're talking about here. And the reason is the potential confusion that I alluded to before in the 10,000 versus 3,000 sources of drinking water difference between the federal and state codes. In California, we've got a very well-established program for determining the beneficial use criteria of groundwater with different water quality objectives for those beneficial uses. Porter Cologne and sources of drinking water I've referred to earlier, but a lot of decisions, precedents, de-designation processes, environmental cleanups, et cetera, have relied upon this 3,000 parts per million TDS and the other beneficial use water quality objectives. Again, I don't think the intent here is today is to consider upending all of that process and procedure, but just to be sure, I'm making it recommendation 1 that we keep this protected water definition to this particular concept of the model groundwater criteria. Now, it's important that a regulatory program have sufficient stability, that agencies can make decisions, and that industry and people can make plans. So my second recommendation, I talked about the oil and gas program being substantially reviewed, validated, made much more transparent. And, we're no longer talking about 1970s practices, but today's practices. So my recommendation 2 is to keep the definition of protected waters unchanged because it offers greater protection in California than the pure EPA interpretation of the definition. One key area where California has gone beyond the federal definition is extending protection not just to underground sources of drinking water, but to all beneficial uses. And these underlined portions from the water code or from the state board model criteria, those are all pointing to where it's extended beyond just drinking water to all beneficial uses. So that's why I say it goes further than the federal. And, in my opinion, this definition is good. It's workable for use in the SB4 groundwater monitoring program, and it should be retained without change. Okay, my third recommendation is to maintain that other half of the definition of protected waters that places them outside of an exempt aquifer. And specifically, I'm thinking of those water-bearing zones into which the produced water is injected that were the subject of the lengthy UIC aquifer exemption process just now nearing completion. A major undertaking. It was thorough. It validated present practices. It put in place a far more rigorous analysis and review process than we had 10 years ago. The conclusions are robust to exempt these aquifers from produced waters. And by definition, these exempt aquifers don't carry beneficial use designations. And that analysis, although it was under the auspices of the Underground Injection Control Program, it's relevant to well stimulation as well. And it is currently in the definition of protected waters. And I see no reason to extend groundwater monitoring into waters that don't have beneficial uses and that are exempt. I think the element of this definition of protected waters is very important. We've already gone beyond the federal definition by including all beneficial uses, not specific to drinking water. And And to ignore the extensive amount of work that was done on these aquifer exemptions would do a disservice to that massive effort. And again, it would serve no useful purpose. A final thought here on this is that there's room throughout these processes for adaptive management. So the review process, some examples here are for the review process for aquifer exemptions. They're robust, they're transparent. The state and regional boards have to provide formal concurrence to these proposals. The US EPA has to review Dogger's recommendations, and they issue a formal approval. Exemptions can't be granted to aquifers with a reasonable likelihood of a beneficial use. So from a regulatory perspective, there's a lot of continuing oversight of these exemptions, which I think argues for not changing the definition now. If something happens, you've already got the trigger to come in. And then finally, operators are continuously on the watch for technology or practice improvements. And although not adaptive management in what we usually think of it in a regulatory management framework, it's still from a technology and best practices, they're looking to continuously improve. So in summary, maintaining the definition of protected waters with the exemption is still subject to site-specific reviews and ongoing improvements by industry and operators, and I would advocate we keep them the same. Thank you. Oh, are you going to do the handoffs?
If we have any questions, I don't.
Out there. We'll save them for the discussion, perhaps. Yes.
That's good.
Okay. Okay, that's stable.
Good afternoon. Peter Zawaslansky from Terraphase Engineering. I am going to make remarks regarding the same topic as Dan had just done, and you've laid the groundwork for a lot of what I was going to say, so I appreciate that. So I'm going to be talking about the current definition of protected waters and the recommendation that the current definition be retained. And this is a summary of that statement, and Dan had already covered a lot of this, but I'll summarize it briefly. That is to say that the exempted aquifers, by definition, have no reasonable, likely beneficial uses, and therefore requiring oil and gas operators to monitor those aquifers serves no useful purpose. And likewise, waters with TDS greater than 10,000 are not reasonably likely to be suitable for any beneficial uses and cannot be economically treated. And again, requiring operators to monitor water with these TDS higher than 10,000 serves no useful purpose. And I'll get into a few arguments as to why I believe that to be true. There is no new evidence or information that has arisen since 2014, since SB4, since the development of the model criteria that would suggest that there's a need to or merit for the revision of the definition of protected water. So no new information would suggest that there's no need for change. And as Dan said, revision to the current exemptions and the definition of protected water could also call into question thousands of past agency approvals that go well beyond well stimulation treatment monitoring. This already has been as well mentioned by Dan, so I'll just briefly describe it. So the definition of protected water is water with less than 10,000 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids, i.e. USDW, and being outside an exempt aquifer. Again, a little bit repetitive, I apologize for that, but USDW as defined by Title 40 CFR is an aquifer which supplies any public water system or which contains a sufficient quantity and quality of water to supply a public water system or contains less than 10,000 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids, and as well, which is not an exempted aquifer. Again, Dan mentioned the state definition of drinking water beneficial use, which is 3,000 milligrams per liter TDS, and must sustain an average yield of 200 gallons per day, and is not contaminated to a degree where treatment is infeasible. So, actually, I'm going to skip a slide here. I'm going to go to this slide here. This is, I wanted to put those numbers in context. Because we talk about 10,000, we talk about 3,000. What does that really mean in terms of water salinity? And I find this to be a useful tool to do so. So this chart divides water into 4 categories: fresh, brackish, saline, and brine. Fresh water is defined by being less than 500 ppm, and it's also coincident with the EPA drinking water MCL. Agricultural irrigation water is about 2,000, at which point most crops are not tolerant of that irrigation water. That's in the brackish area. You start looking at some inland seas, such as the Baltic Sea, Black Sea, 8,000, 18,000. And then you get to seawater. Average seawater is about 35,000 ppm. Once you go above that, you're into the brines, which are brine pools, salt ponds, and things like that. So when you look at where these definitions fall, they fall squarely into the brackish category. The state definition is above both drinking water and agricultural limit, and then the USDW is in the range of inland seas. There are other definitions you can find in literature, such as this one, where between 10,000 and 35,000 is described as highly saline water. But suffice it to say that by the time you're at 10,000 ppm, the quality of that water is very poor, and it does not have any beneficial uses. So this leads into my argument that the USDW definition leads to a very conservative threshold for water protection. So, as I said, the water with TDS of 10,000 has no beneficial uses, not for drinking water, not for agriculture, not for industrial purposes. And the 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS threshold was developed as part of the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1974, was then adopted in 1980 for the UIC program. It's well established in federal policy. It has been reviewed by the EPA numerous times. And it has been deemed to be appropriate for its purpose, that is to protect underground sources of water for human consumption. But the 10,000 milligram per liter threshold is very significantly conservative because, as you saw earlier, it exceeds all standards for use. So the assumption is that even though 10,000 ppm is the standard, that water would have to be treated prior to any use. So it provides a margin of safety for the protection of usable groundwater. Something to keep in mind, and Dan alluded to this, is that USDW protects vast quantities of water. The volume, this is a study that was done recently in 2016, where the volume of USDW, or water with TDS lower than 10,000 milligram per liter, was estimated in the Central Valley. And in the top 9,000 feet, that estimate is 3.2 billion acre feet. In the top 3,000 feet, that estimate is 1.8 billion acre feet. And just for comparison, the average groundwater extraction, the total average groundwater extraction in the Central Valley is 10 million acre feet per year. So these are vast quantities of water that falls into this category of USDW. This is just within the Central Valley. But because this water has no practical use at 10,000 milligrams per liter, there's the need for treatment, and treatment of inland brackish water with TDS of 10,000 is simply impractical. So the idea of protecting water with higher salinities really doesn't make sense, and it serves no useful purpose. And the reason why desalination of brackish inland groundwater is not economically feasible is described in this slide. Desalination costs increase with the salinity of the water being treated. And there's a graph here on the right that illustrates that. Groundwater extraction costs also increase with depth. So obviously pumping groundwater from great depths is quite expensive. It takes a lot of energy. There are also present elevated trace elements in Central Valley groundwater, such as boron, which make the standard desalination technology, makes desalination more expensive than the standard desalination technology. It's a different treatment train. But most importantly, inland treatment systems have no feasible means of disposing of resulting waste brines. And you can see, again, here on this, in this graph, the costs of disposing of the volume of brine on the right that is generated with water above 10,000 as compared to 3,000 ppm TDS is about doubled, as well as the energy use required to treat that water. So there are significant challenges with treating water of this salinity. And consequently, you will find that all desalination plants in California are built on the coast, and the reason for that is because they can dispose of their brine to the ocean. And the volume of brine generated would be enormous if it were treated in any case. But in the case of an inland desalination plant, there's really no place to put that brine. Another way to look at this is that the costs for desalination, of course, are very high. This is a picture of the Carlsbad desalination plant in San Diego. This plant was built over 15 years of permitting and construction at a total cost of $1 billion. It treats water currently at $2,100 per acre foot. The average cost of irrigation water to farmers in water districts in California is between $40 and $100 per acre foot. That's subsidized cost, obviously, but that is the cost that farmers are paying. And so when you look at the differential between what it costs currently for irrigation water versus the cost that would be required to treat brackish water to a point where it could be used as irrigation water, it simply doesn't pencil out. And here's actually an interesting little fact, is that the Carlsbad plant can treat 50 million gallons of water a day, which seems like a lot, but it would take 56,000 years for that plant to treat the volume of USDW that I pointed out in an earlier slide. So this kind of illustrates the vast volumes of USDW that are present in the Central Valley and the difficulties with treating that volume of water. As far as aquifer exemptions, Dan very eloquently described the complex and technically challenging aspect of exempting aquifers and the regulatory aspect of that. But it is a stringent approach, and the aquifer exemption process involves obviously the operators, public agencies, and the public. There's a public review process as well. This process has led to, I would say, a greater focus on the technical development of applications and a more rigorous approach in the agency review of those applications. A couple other points to make is that as far as exempted groundwater, groundwater in oil and gas production areas commonly contains naturally occurring petroleum hydrocarbons, as well as commonly contains naturally elevated trace elements such as boron, arsenic, and mercury. I mentioned earlier that those complicate the treatment of that water to where it could be consumed as per public supply. So these conditions render the water unfit for consumption and require more extensive and different kinds of treatment that would render desalination much more expensive. So I'll leave you with the same slide that I started. We recommend that the current definition of protected water be maintained for the reasons stated here. We believe that the requiring oil and gas operators to monitor exempt aquifers serves no purpose, as equally requiring monitoring of groundwater with TDS greater than 10,000 likewise serves no purpose. Reiterate one more time is that there is no new information, no new evidence has arisen since 2014 that would suggest a need to change these protected water definitions, and we feel that if we were to change these definitions, it would call past agency approvals into question. And that's all I have. Yes.
Could you go back to that slide that quotes the king?
Yes.
Oh, that's right there. Do you want me to identify myself? Catherine Mortson at Natural Resources and Water Committee. I spoke with Dr. King when this paper came out, and I just want to make the point that when they did this review, they took no account of the actual regulatory status of the water. So I would imagine that 1,800 million acre feet and that 3,200 million acre feet includes actually a fair amount of exempted aquifers, and it has no bearing really on how feasible all of that water is, how accessible all of that water is. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. Not that I see coming.
All right, thank you,
thank you.
Peter. I'll set up the next one. Our next speaker is Brianna Mordick. Ms. Mordick is a senior scientist at the Natural Resources Defense Council. She is a geologist and technical expert in oil and gas exploration, production activities, and carbon capture and sequestration. Please join me in welcoming Brianna Mordick.
You. So yeah. So kind of start with the conclusions. Just to start, we do fully support the groundwater monitoring program and the ability for both the Water Board and the USGS to perform the independent monitoring of water quality in areas of oil and gas production. The program has already produced a lot of really important and excellent results, so we do fully support it. But in terms of the definition specifically of protected water, I want to focus on the aquifer exemption piece. So California's aquifer exemption program has been plagued with problems that have resulted or may result in impacts to water resources, including both protected resources under both state and federal law. There's a significant data gap regarding the performance of and impacts to groundwater from the aquifer exemption program due to lack of monitoring. That's under the EPA program and at least until recently under California's program. So our recommendation is to maintain the 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS portion of the definition, but to eliminate the exempted aquifer portion of the definition. And to be clear, monitoring and exempt aquifers may not always be appropriate or necessary, but we think the blanket exclusion from the definition of protected water is too broad. So I'll discuss some of the reasons why we think that is. So we've already seen this. Obviously, the definition of protected water excludes those that are water that's an exempted aquifer, specifically citing the aquifers that meet the criteria of the federal code. And again, this is a long definition, but in sum, basically, aquifers can be exempted if they're either currently serve as a source of drinking water or could be a source of drinking water, but meet one of these different standards. The standard that's most commonly applied in California and around the country is that the aquifer is mineral, hydrocarbon, or geothermal energy producing, or essentially that is an oil-bearing zone and can produce in commercial quantities. So it's kind of important to note what's missing from this definition. You'll see that there's not a lot of science or rigor in how these aquifer exemptions are granted. Now, granted, some of that may happen through EPA's review process, but it's certainly not guaranteed by the definition of the criteria for an exemption. So in our view, the aquifer exemption criteria, which are more than 30 years old, do not adequately protect groundwater, including California's groundwater. The criteria don't account for our current understanding of the importance of groundwater. They don't consider the latest groundwater depletion data, both nationally and in California. They don't account for changing water treatment and pumping technologies. They allow for arbitrary aquifer boundaries that are not justified by geologic analysis. Again, critically for this point, they don't require adequate modeling or monitoring monitoring to ensure that contamination won't migrate beyond the exemption boundary. They're not justified by scientifically based water quality data. They don't take into account future use of groundwater, population increases, changes due to climate change, and we think they inappropriately prioritize fossil fuel production over drinking water and allow exemptions solely on the basis that that hydrocarbons are present without any analysis of the potential beneficial uses. So as you know, some of the previous presenters have shown, California does have existing, additional standards that they include for exemptions on top of this, which we think are very important, but it's really important to note that the vast majority of California's aquifer exemptions were granted using only the EPA criteria when California received primacy for the UIC program. And this is not just our conclusion. In 2016, the U.S. Government Accountability Office put out a white paper critiquing EPA's entire UIC program, but including specific issues with the aquifer exemption program. And they concluded that EPA and the states do not collect adequate information to assess whether groundwater is protected from Class 2 injection. So a little bit of history for those who aren't familiar. In 1981, the Division of Oil and Gas, which was the precursor to DOGGR, applied to EPA for Class 2 primacy. The UIC program had just been created in 1980. And so as part of their application for primacy, they included a list of proposed exempt aquifers. And they requested exemption on the basis that the aquifers were co-located with oil and gas fields, already contained hydrocarbons and generally high salt concentrations, and were already being used for waste disposal in many cases. So what they did was submit this series of hand-drawn maps, you can see one on the right, that were drawn in the 70s and 80s, which showed the current productive boundaries of all of the oil and gas fields in the state. And so DOC proposed and EPA approved that those productive boundaries be the administrative boundaries of the aquifer exemptions. So as you can see, in September of 1982, EPA granted primacy to DOGGR, and they approved those boundaries to be the aquifer exemption boundaries. So it's also kind of just important to note that the majority of UIC wells nationwide inject into aquifers that don't meet the definition of USDW. California is a unique circumstance because the oil and gas occurs so shallow here and often occurs in conjunction with groundwater that meets the definition of USDW. And EPA has granted thousands of aquifer exemptions, 95% of which are for Class 2 wells, which are injection wells associated with oil and gas production. California has a very large number of exemptions, at least 1,100, but EPA's database is very incomplete. They have a record of more than 3,300 approved aquifer exemptions nationwide, but their official database only lists 19 aquifer exemptions in California, which is clearly not accurate. So this is a page from the EPA's approval of DOGGR's primacy. So it wasn't actually just groundwater that contained oil and gas. They also exempted some aquifers that did not contain hydrocarbons. And often, as you can see from the chart here, these exemptions were often granted despite the fact that very little information was presented about the quality of water in those zones. So you can see some of the highlights there. In some cases, water had been injected going back to the 40s and 50s. And in many cases, you can see there, the water that was being injected was had a much higher TDS content than the water in place. In some cases, you see that exemptions were granted even though there was no analysis of the groundwater in that field. They took, thanks. I think there might be one on here too. There we go. Oh, thanks. They took analysis from adjacent fields. And again, just to reiterate, this is how most of the aquifer exemptions in California were granted. So here's just an example. In 2015, it was revealed that DOGGR had improperly permitted thousands of wells to inject outside the boundaries of exempt aquifers. That happened because over time, as the fields expanded, additional wells were permitted in those new production areas, but the aquifer exemption boundaries remained the same and were not expanded. So this was actually brought to NRDC's attention by a farmer who lives near this field, the Deer Creek field in Tulare County. He and his son just kind of stumbled upon this and found that this well sitting out here was outside the exempt boundary. But this map shows another really important thing, which is that so this shaded area is the aquifer exemption. These red dots are the wells. The circles around them are quarter-mile radius. So that's the sort of nominal, what's called area of review under the UIC program. It actually doesn't have any bearing to the aquifer exemptions, but when you get a permit for a Class 2 well, you have to designate your area of review, which is nominally the area in which you think injected fluids might migrate or endanger groundwater. So you can see in this case that those area of review bubbles extend far beyond the boundaries of the exempt aquifer. So the problem is larger than just having wells permitted outside the boundary. There's reason to suspect that even wells that are located within the boundaries of exempt aquifers, the fluids that they're injecting may be migrating beyond those boundaries. As many may be familiar with, Dogger and the Water Board, in response to this, a series of emergency regulations were passed, basically setting deadlines by which the wells that were injecting into non-exempt aquifers either had to be shut down or approved exemptions had to be granted. And the way that most of the noncompliance has been dealt with is by expanding or granting new aquifer exemptions. But given that exempt aquifers are precluded from the definition of protected water, that would preclude those new exemptions from monitoring, except in the cases where monitoring was specified as part of those aquifer exemptions, which in some cases it has been. And so this, again, after that, so the final deadline was supposed to be February 15th, 2017. That was supposed to be the final deadline by which all of these non-compliant wells were supposed to stop injecting. But Dogger and the Water Board requested more time for those and chose not to enforce that shutdown deadline for approximately 1,600 wells covering 29 aquifer exemptions or 29 fields. The rationale was that they thought that those aquifer exemptions were in process, and so they thought there was enough information that they would approve those aquifer exemptions. But in some cases, we've seen that hasn't been the case, where the Water Board has actually differed with Dogger and the oil companies and which portions of exempt aquifer they think should be exempt. And so, again, just sort of highlighting some of the ongoing issues with the aquifer exemption program and why we think excluding them completely is too broad. And then finally, so this is a new memorandum of agreement between the Water Board and Dogger that was written as a result of these issues. So one thing that this MOA contemplates is that aquifer exemptions could either be revised or revoked. And so in our view, because that's a potential outcome, having monitoring in or near these zones is important to help inform that decision. It's also, under the federal standards, not clear that there is any actual criteria for revoking or revising aquifer exemptions. So in essence, these aquifer exemptions are granted for life, which again is another reason we think that they should be subject to monitoring if appropriate. So yeah, just to reiterate, given the lax criteria under which most aquifer exemptions in the state were granted, the history of problems with the UIC program in California, the fact that fluids injected into exempt aquifers, including potentially well stimulation fluids, may not remain within the boundaries of those exempt aquifers, and that the Water Board and Dogger MOA contemplates that aquifer exemptions could be revised or reversed. Exempt aquifers should not be categorically excluded from the definition of protected water. That's it. Thank you.
Any questions for Ms. Mordick?
Let him first.
Thanks. I think we'll probably get into more of this during the discussion. So I just wanted to understand, in describing the different aquifer exemptions, so this is actually asking you if I'm getting this right or not, to make sure I'm understanding it. So you had mentioned some of the exemptions were based purely on whether the zone you're injecting to is hydrocarbon bearing, with no other analysis.
Well, and that it wasn't currently serving as a source of drinking water, right? I mean, in reality, it was based on these maps.
Okay. And then there's aquifer exemptions that have been through the exhaustive process, where there's been the chemical analysis, there's been the geological analysis showing zonal isolation,
Right.
things like that. And
Right.
those, I don't think you can do a lot more science than that.
Yeah, I think we've been pretty happy with the outcome of the process. Yeah, which is much more rigorous. They've applied California's additional standards to those. And in many cases, the new aquifer exemptions do require monitoring.
Yeah. So there's a subset then that you're thinking have to, that even though they're exempt, the basis for their exemption shouldn't keep them from monitoring.
Exactly, yeah. If the science dictates that, if, people doing the monitoring think that there is reason to suspect that fluids may be moving out of zone, so we wouldn't say that every exempt aquifer in the state should be subject to monitoring, but we don't think there should be a blanket exclusion from the definition of protected water.
Okay. And the ones you would identify are those that haven't had the sort of analysis that the current ones.
I would definitely be on the screening list, yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to, we'll probably come back, but.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Tom Williams, Citizens Coalition for a Safe Community, also Sierra Club, Angeles Chapter, Water Committee. We're quite concerned regarding water resource for the state overall. And might say I've been here before testifying regarding the water fixed tunnels and the cost of water in the future. And we're quite concerned regarding the exemptions and the fact that if we ask DAGA for information regarding the model and the inputs, the outputs, and what happens to the exempt aquifer during these UIC programs, they don't have the data. So we're quite concerned regarding number one, the future of water, especially for Southern California outside of the Central Valley. We're going to programs where we may have generated very large amounts of indirect potable reuse waters. The only place we can store them is in the ground. So I say we're quite concerned about exempt and non-exempt aquifers that are within areas where we may need storage, and storage becomes an issue. Personally, I've worked in the United Arab Emirates, and we would have loved to have 35 milligram water because we were dealing with 40 and over parts per thousand. And we were using reverse osmosis, steam distillation, et cetera, because when there's no water left, you take whatever is there. And if it has hydrocarbon and things like that, that can be dealt with. Everything can be dealt with if you have the water and if it's not been more polluted. And one of our concerns is the continued monitoring of both exempt and non-exempt aquifers associated with oil and gas production, because we can't get the data from DAGA. DAGA doesn't have good models of the UIC programs for each area that they have UIC programs in. There's no models, there's no input-output, there's no ground subsidence, and in the Inglewood field, we've had issues of ground subsidence in production areas, ground uplift in injection areas. So we're quite concerned about those. So we would highly recommend not only retaining the monitoring program on exempt and non-exempt aquifers, but actually improving it to maybe include fracture analysis such as microseismicity and litter, rise and fall of the ground surface, even above the injection areas. So would highly recommend to support your position.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you. Our next speaker is Seth Shonkoff. Dr. Shonkoff is the Executive Director of the Energy Science and Policy Institute at Physicians, Scientists, and Engineers for Healthy Energy. Dr. Shonkoff is an environmental and public health scientist with over 15 years' experience in water, air, climate, and population health research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shonkoff.
Hello, everyone. Oh, wow. All right. Thank you, Water Board, for having me. Thanks for everyone being here and listening. So I will start by just giving, I guess as Dan Tormey started, I'll give a little bit of background of the ways that I've been involved in this space so far and the ways that I continue to be involved with a lot of pertinence to the issue that we're talking about today. So I was on the steering committee for the Senate Bill 4 CCST study. I was also the lead author on the public health sections of that report. I serve on the food safety expert panel, which is convened by the Central Valley Regional Water Quality Control Board, which looks at and provides some scientific guidance on reuse of produced water for agricultural irrigation of food crops. I sit on the Senate Bill 83 UIC program with Dan and Brianna. Lastly, I'm involved in, I didn't know that you're a reviewer, but I'm also involved in the CCST SB 1281 report currently underway. Okay, so let's just get into it. So we all know where this came from. This was the model criteria was pulled together sort of alongside the CCST SB4 study pursuant to SB4. This report, which came up with the model criteria, as we know, stated that monitoring at 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS is appropriate, largely because it aligns with EPA's UIC program and is technically and economically feasible to desalinate water of that TDS concentration. So I'm just going to jump quickly and firstly to the punchline, or my punchline at least, in terms of the reasons to maintain at least the current definition of protected groundwater. So the current definition of protected groundwater protects brackish groundwater resources, which is important to the state of California. Population growth, drought, and climate change in California will certainly necessitate the increased use of brackish groundwater resources currently and into the future. California has significant brackish groundwater resources, including that in oil and gas producing areas. Desalination of brackish groundwater is economically and technically feasible and less energy intensive and produces less brine than desalination of seawater. We heard a little bit about that in Peter's talk. The federal government, as well as professional organizations, including API, have recommended the use of a 10,000 milligram per liter TDS criterion to define protected groundwater during well stimulation. And other states have an explicit definition of protected groundwater. And the thing that I wanted to add is that in the context of drought and climate change and increasing population growth that we're expecting here in the state, there should be a consideration of raising that TDS criterion to something above 10,000. And it's beyond my pay grade or beyond the resources I have right now to determine what that ceiling should be. But I do think, okay, Tom says 12 or 15. We can have that conversation at another point, I presume. So one of the reasons to have these definitions of protected groundwater is that, as we found in the CCST study, hydraulic fracturing in not all cases, but in a number of cases has been observed as occurring at very shallow depths and in proximity to groundwater which should be protected or is approaching the concentration of what should be protected. And in the case of the Los Angeles Basin, this is also from the CCST study, from the Los Angeles Basin case study chapter in particular. I wanted to just walk you through this figure, and this also is where I'm sort of talking about the data behind the statement of shallow hydraulic fracturing near or in water which should be protected is coming from. So these, is this? Yes. These dark bands here is the shallowest hydraulic fracture recorded in the field, and this is as of 2015 when we conducted this analysis. And the shades of color denote, in broad terms, the TDS concentrations, and then the numbers that you see in each of these bars are the TDS concentrations that are observed at that depth below ground surface. And as you can see in the Inglewood oil field, for example, while there's no indication that hydraulic fracturing occurred in protected groundwater or groundwater that should be protected, it is not far away from that. In the Whittier field, however, there is some data, at least at that time, to suggest that there was some hydraulic fracturing that occurred in groundwater which should be protected pursuant to this definition. So again, maintaining this definition and being very careful with where we conduct our oil and gas development, and not just hydraulic fracturing, is imperative to protecting groundwater resources in the state. So I'm glad to be in California, so I can actually show this slide, and hopefully everyone in the room is on board with this. So without climate change at the bottom, we're still in need of brackish groundwater, right, in the future. With climate change, we're really in the need of brackish groundwater in the future. And so, again, maintaining a definition as it's stated right now and potentially making that definition more stringent is prudent, not only for water access for drinking, but also for economic drivers of industry. And we've heard about this in a couple of the other presentations. The amount of brackish groundwater that we know of that should be protected in the state is not decreasing, it's actually increasing. So in 1991, the estimated fresh groundwater was around 1,000 cubic kilometers in the Central Valley. And in 2016, my colleagues Mary Kang and Rob Jackson over at Stanford published a pretty significant paper that actually they found far more brackish groundwater resources, and about 60% of groundwater resources in the Central Valley are brackish, and the Tulare Basin, where substantial oil and gas development occurs, contains also significant amounts of brackish groundwater. This is just another figure from Stanton and colleagues, just to show that down to around 3,000 feet below ground surface, about 90% of the Central Valley aquifer system is fresh. I'm just sort of listing off reasons why it's prudent to continue protecting groundwater. This is a cross-section of the San Joaquin Valley, and probably most people in the room are aware of the differences between the east side and the west side in terms of groundwater resources and the amounts of them and their total dissolved solids. So the east side certainly has quite a bit more fresh and lower salinity groundwater than the west side. Although the west side, it's looking more and more like, and this has been characterized in a number of studies over the past number of years, the west side, the shallow groundwater, the groundwater you first come into contact with as you're drilling down, is often quite a bit more saline than groundwater resources that lie below it. And a lot of the reason, or some of the purported reasons why that might be the case, is that it's perched groundwater, which is likely a product of agricultural drainage and other processes. And so throwing the whole west side out as poor groundwater is actually not warranted in the face of what we know about these resources from the data. So desalinization. Desalinization is something which is already here and is expected to grow, and the majority of desalinization in the United States is actually not at the coasts, it's inland. And there's a variety of reasons for that, many of which come down to economics and all sorts of economic reasons. Right now, or as of 2010, there were about 650 desal plants, 67% municipal, 18% industry, 9% for power, and 6% other. And so, yes, this is sort of where, unfortunately, this is where we're going, and perhaps California in particular. So this is a fairly new desal plant in San Antonio, Texas. This opened in early 2017. It removes about 99.9% of the dissolved solids. They process about 12 million gallons per day, and it uses reverse osmosis. For each 10 gallons that it treats, you get about a gallon of brine, and then that brine is actually disposed of in saline aquifers. So it's injected downhole into saline aquifers, which makes it feasible to not only have a desal plant at the coast where you can discharge to the ocean, but to actually have these increasingly inland and use injection wells to dispose of the brine. Comparatively, seawater, which is around 35,000 plus milligrams per liter TDS, you can expect to have about 4 gallons of brine come out of that compared to, again, the 1 gallon per brine for brackish water. And brackish water, around, under 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS. So this is an example of something that's in Texas, but it's something which may actually be an increasing possibility or a more widespread reality in the state of California moving forward. I'm sorry?
What's the TDS there at San Antonio?
That is a great question. Oh, repeat it? Oh, sorry. Bill asked, what is the TDS of the groundwater being pushed through reverse osmosis in San Antonio. And I don't know, but I imagine it's below 10,000 milligrams per liter. Sorry to be drowning you in data today, but this is another visualization that looks at depth below land surface in feet, and on the x-axis, total dissolved solids in milligrams per liter. And as you can see, if you head up this 10,000 parts per million line, just as was shown in other data from other studies, about 60% or a lot of groundwater that's at 3,000 milligrams per liter, at 3,000 feet below ground surface is below 10,000 milligrams per liter. And it sounds like the folks that have presented before me today, agree that 10,000 milligrams per liter is defensible and is agreed upon across multiple sectors. I just wanted to highlight a couple more. So the American Petroleum Institute stated in 2009 that at a minimum, it's recommended that surface casing be set at least 100 feet below the deepest underground source of drinking water. The Groundwater Protection Council, also in 2009, stated hydraulic fracture in oil or gas-bearing zones that occur in non-exempt USDWs should either be stopped or restricted to the use of materials that do not pose a risk of endangering groundwater or have the potential to impact public health. So maintaining this definition and even considering the possibility of looking beyond it is something which certainly has a lot of support across multiple sectors. My colleagues and I, this is my colleague Don DiGilio and Rob Jackson at Stanford, we reviewed produced water salinity concentrations across all 27 oil and gas producing states. And every red dot here is where produced water was below 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS. So while that certainly means that there's oil production happening in oil-bearing zones, obviously, certainly a proportion of that is also occurring in low salinity zones that could be treated in the future for reuse of some sort. The 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS is something which is shared across various definitions across multiple states. And there's also different states that have made different decisions. So Montana and Wyoming removed their protection around hydraulic fracturing and well stimulation. And Colorado, Kansas, North Dakota, et cetera, have sort of poorly defined or undefined or geographically dependent definitions, which create a lot of confusion. So I'll just leave you with my 4 conclusions here. Maintaining a definition of protected groundwater during well stimulation and other forms of oil and gas development using the criteria established for a USDW is reasonable and defensible. California should maintain current standards to join other states in having explicit criteria for protection of groundwater equivalent to that of a USDW during well stimulation. California should implement similar requirements for groundwater monitoring during all oil and gas development and not only during well stimulation. If there was one overarching conclusion from our 2,000 or so page SB4 study with CCST, it was that while well stimulation introduces some different things to pay attention to, all oil and gas production has potential to create certain types of hazards and risks that are not specific to hydraulic fracturing. And lastly, in the context of where we are and where we're headed in the future, in the context of population growth, a changing climate, and certainly more and more droughts, and given that desalinization is possible, and that even if you increase the protected groundwater definition above 10,000, it probably wouldn't go all the way up to 35,000 seawater definition, and it would be economically feasible, increasingly as we move into the future and the demand for water increases, to consider treating that water for beneficial use. And here are my references. And thank you.
Do we have any questions for Dr. Shonkoff? Thank you.
So that concludes our formal presentations. We had the blue cards at the front. I noticed that, Tom, you have one. Did anybody else want to make a formal comment? No? You've got one, okay. So let's start with Tom. You can either stand up here or you can sit there, whatever you feel comfortable with.
I feel comfortable. Dr. Tom Williams, Citizens Coalition for Safe Communities, Sierra Club, also a member of the American Association of Petroleum Geologists and a few other things. Basically, since we're in Sacramento, my greatest concern regarding groundwater and oil and gas is the monitoring and enforcement of existing regs by the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources. Case in point, nice clear definition. The blowout well in the Alicio Canyon gas field have been documented over 15 years as having a subsurface shutoff valve. For 15 years, documents given to Dogger accepted them. They were in the files. However, a representative of the operator indicated a couple of years ago, we took those out in 1979 because we were having so much trouble with them. I.e., nobody verified the documents that were being submitted to Dogger in response to a state permit. So how can I believe what's going on from Dogger? We have asked Dogger for UIC locations of the injection well injection point in the field. They're supposed to have a UIC model, a UIC program, but getting the documents as to what's going in, where's it going, and what's coming out ain't there for various reasons. The division does not verify what is, as built, as permitted, and there's a real problem with that. So might say the water resources might be able to do it, but when your fellow agency doesn't have the documentation that can be verified as being in place, it's conceptual. We don't have the data to make a reasonable estimate as to where's the water going, what is it doing, and how is it affecting other groundwater resources. And if Mayor Garcetti of Los Angeles wants to recycle 100% of the sewage at Hyperion, the only way that they can do that is to store it underground at night. So there's a real problem as to water resources are becoming an important element, not just for the use of that resource, but where are you going to put it? How are you going to protect it? Because I don't want to drink something that's come out of the Inglewood oil field. And I want to have some relative assurance that the government agencies, Dogger, Water Resources, are doing a due diligence job as to where the water is going, where is it being affected, and how much it's going to cost us eventually to pump it out and use it. So, and I say, compared to the water fix tunnel, I would prefer to do desal anytime. Thank you.
No applause?
Hi, I'm Bill Alia with Environmental Working Group. I'm hoping for some roundtable kind of discussions here, and I have a lot to say right now, and maybe hearing a response to the prior gentleman, Dr. Peter Zalwalansky's presentation, and a rebuttal to that if anyone has anything or comments on it. I'm probably not the expert to say. I do want to say that the reason we're here and is because of the SB4 monitoring, and that this is a very positive thing that that's underway, that there was basically no water quality monitoring that was available to the public until SB4 mandated it. And I know there was a struggle about, well, how do you monitor just for the frac wells? And we ended up being much broader than that. And it was discussed in this room, 4 years ago, and that's what's occurring. The broad, more general monitoring rather than trying to focus on a well or wells. So I think the information we're starting to get from the program is going to be really helpful for further analysis of, are we doing the right job, setting aside the definition of protected waters for the meantime. It's just that's a very positive thing that's happening in the state of California that we didn't have for decades. So I still want to, if there's more time later, I may talk about once I hear some back and forth here. I'm sorry I missed the first half hour. I was on a call.
It'll look like you do?
Yes. I was wondering, who's going to start, but yeah, so, in the nature of roundtable discussion, it sounds like my name's Dan Tormey. I was the speaker while you were on your call. Yeah. It sounds like the speakers at least are at a point of consensus that the 10,000 parts per million definition of protected waters is appropriate. Wouldn't recommend change at this point. And with respect to the exemption, so I'm putting this forth for discussion, not as fact, by the way. With regard to the exemption, it sounds like, we got into it a little bit with my clarification question that where there has been a, recent last 5 years review of an aquifer exemption with the chemical analysis, the structural geology, the hydrogeology, that those don't raise the concern that we're missing monitoring of an exempt aquifer. It's, I think, the only place where there's discussion with respect purely to the definition of protected water would be those fields that received an exemption early in the process from EPA on the basis of being a hydrocarbon-bearing zone that you're injecting back into. Is that a fair statement? Yeah.
It's my understanding.
So it's Meg Rosegate. So it's
my understanding that the aquifer exemption review process that's gone on over the last few years has gone back and looked at those original exemption boundaries. And so there really aren't any aquifers now that have, of the old sort. Every single one of those aquifer exemptions has been reviewed, including the areas within the historical boundaries. So I'm not certain that there's any subset of aquifers out there that have escaped the scrutiny that's been ongoing for the last few years.
So just to clarify, that has not been the case. We have only looked at the proposed areas associated with the packages that we received from the operators through DOC and our collaborative review with the regional boards.
It's been reported to me that many of those packages do, and they have been required to get into the historical boundaries.
We have not reviewed the existing, the grandfathered in, if you will, the 1983 primacy boundaries that were established where they were oil-bearing areas that were identified in the Gold Book, and they were deemed exempt, and there were, I think, a dozen or so other aquifers that were also exempted that were outside of those hydrocarbon-bearing areas.
Say your name.
This is Maris Dunsmore with CRC, and I'm a geologist, and just to clarify, so the Gold Book was the productive limit when those things were drawn, and as a geologist, I miss the colored pencils that we used to get to use when we did all these drawings by hand. It's more fun that way, but they were the productive limit, and so it was as far as they knew that the oil and gas extended, and so most of the wells that are on the outside of those exempt aquifers are wells that are still within an oil and gas bearing zone, but just not within the original productive limits. And the oil-water contact, something we define as where it's sort of economic above that, oil usually floats, economic above that to produce, and below that, it's not economic, but it's still oil-bearing, and it still contains quite a bit of hydrocarbon. It's just not worth putting a straw on it and trying to get it out. Geo-clarification. Thanks.
Anybody want to take a turn?
Bill, did you have something else you wanted to say? Okay. A little bit earlier, there was a presentation, I can't remember whose it was, but it was revolving around the new process, if you will, under the Public Resources Code 3131, that in broad strokes, there's three parts to it. The first part is that any aquifer exemption proposal needs to meet the federal criteria. The second part is related to beneficial uses. So the kind of, paraphrasing, it requires that a aquifer exemption be done in a way where it won't adversely affect any current or potential future beneficial use water. So it's kind of, I think, a little bit misspoken in the way in which it was being characterized. And that it needs, the third part being that it needs to stay contained in the area that's exempted.
Bill Alio, Environmental Working Group again. I do have a question on the one slide you showed about the cost of desal was hyper expensive compared to getting groundwater. And the numbers we get out of Kern County, they're paying, I think, was it $30 an acre foot for water, buying it from Chevron and lightly treated water versus $135 to $175 for water either they pumped up from State Water Project, I think was $135 per acre foot. Groundwater pumping from their own property was about $175 an acre foot. So I think your slide was showing, look, to desal is way beyond that. Is there any comment from anyone in the room about the cost? Because there are other people saying we may resort to desal in the Central Valley and other places at that cost. It'd be pretty interesting when you can right now get it out of the State Water Project if there was water to be gotten someday, and there may not be.
guess just in general terms, I've looked at desalination and other, expensive forms of treatment in Australian oil and gas fields. And Peter alluded to this, that when you're in an inland environment, you always have the problem of the brine. It's like at least 30% of the initial water that you're trying to treat gets, hyper concentrated as a brine. And, in some places in Australia, they could make salt and sell it. But for the most part, you were back to having to inject it somewhere. And the same kinds of discussions we're having now with respect to injection of produced water into the subsurface, you have the same conversation with injecting this brine back into the subsurface, only now you've concentrated it by, 4 or 5 times. So it's always the brine in the inland setting that becomes challenging, and you need a home for it that doesn't threaten the water resources you're trying to protect by doing that in the first place. So it gets a little complicated, when you're in an inland environment.
And I know this isn't a workshop on desal, but considering we're all worried about climate change, how expensive is it in that regard to produce the energy to drive the solid salts out of this water? Isn't that an issue? That it's not just expensive, you're using a lot of energy to drive stuff through an RO filter.
Yeah, I don't know if this is a good answer to the question, but it is expensive and it is energy intensive, and we often, right now, use types of energy to do that are not great for air quality and the climate. This might be a wishful thinking on my part, but I would probably put money on if we get into a situation, when we get into a situation that we need a lot of desal, inland desal, we're going to be in a situation where people are going to, come up with something, bring the cost down, and use energy that's, not carbon intensive. That's right. And so I would maintain that we should be doing everything we can to protect groundwater resources for that purpose. Now I'm done.
No one wants to talk around here. Famous for talking too much. And that's why I support the position of my colleagues at NRDC, is that this water's precious, even though it can be a little bit salty, because we had a 4-year drought and people were freaking out, and we had a 120-year or so drought between 1300 and 1420 AD. So that 4 years is nothing compared to a 25-year drought, let alone a 100-year drought. So we may someday be going, sorry, we're losing 6 million almond trees in the southern San Joaquin Valley, or pistachios, or people won't have drinking water, or whatever. There's going to be some tough choices someday when it comes down to the kind of extended drought that's possible in the West.
Why don't you keep the mic?
Again, one of my concerns, I say I kind of trust water resources information. However, I was exposed to water fix. However, with Dogger, numerous cases where we go to the files and we can't find the programs. And you talk about UIC. UIC is supposed to be for enhanced oil recovery, but when you actually go as to where is the water being injected, where is the water moving, how much oil is it sweeping, and how much oil is being produced, the documents aren't there. So if you're going to worry about the exempt or the non-exempt groundwater, who's going to have the information that will tell you where the exempt ends and where the non-exempt begins? And how does it move? It doesn't just sit there, it moves. So when you talk about exempt, can you believe any of the documentation that is submitted by the oil and gas industry through Dogger when you know that records are falsified? How can you get an independent verification of the information that's monitoring coming from an oil field with an exempt aquifer? Where is it going? And when you get to stimulation, fracking, or whatever you want to call it, how many people do the information gathering and documentation and submittal to Dogger, and where do they put it? I don't know. I know that in most cases you got to have a model. Okay, that model needs data input in order to show what's going on. And we're kind of trying to make projections as to risk in the future based upon a very flawed information base right now, and for the past 20 years. So I always go back, get the information first before you can make good decisions on what to protect and what not to protect. But in the background, the risk. There is a risk. We only have so much water. I've worked in areas where every cup of water you protected. Why? Because you didn't have any choice. Here we have the ocean next door. Okay, that's only 35 parts per thousand. Oh, we can desal it. It's being desaled right now. Why? Because brine production. Okay, in Dubai, we had brine production, but we also had a sea that was 40,000. So I am quite concerned regarding what do we make our decisions based upon, whether it's exempt or not exempt. It's on data which I cannot get verification as being true and accurate and when it was presented. So I say I've seen too many false records in the Division of Oil, Gas, and Geothermal Resources that document things aren't the way they should be. Thank you.
Bill Alio here, as some people know, I was Dogger's biggest critic circa 2011 till 2015 or so. I think they're making a lot of progress. Tom, when you talk about falsified or missing or bad records at Dogger, you think that's still the case, or are they starting to build databases that we can trust, even given data given to them by the oil companies, and aren't they doing a lot better?
In 2015, we had the largest blowout. The only thing, does anyone ever know what the content of gas that was being blown out was? No? They finally did one sample. They sent a contractor into a explosive zone gas concentration to take samples. That's the character of the Southern California Gas Company, to put at risk somebody's life. But on the other side, hey, they let it blow, it's just methane, don't worry about it. However, the documents in that well and many other wells were then later scrubbed. So yeah, now you go back and try to find subsurface shutoff valves. No, difficult to find because they weren't there in the beginning. But we have documents from 2015 that says, oh yeah, for over 10 years there were subsurface shutoff valves. Dogger's records need to be independently verified through a program, and any new data must be verified by somebody that can lose their license if they verify corrupt information. So I don't trust Division of Oil and Gas. Yes, they've greatly improved. Why? Because they got so much bad exposure from so many different places. But it still hasn't remedied the basic element as to the inputs. Every UIC well is supposed to be part of a enhanced oil recovery program. Where's the programs? When was the last time you actually saw a UIC injection and UIC-related production? We had one, but now the guy that did the surface movements is no longer with the state of California, so we can't get him. So, in a word, Division of Oil, Gas, Geothermal Resources has improved because they were under severe fire for so long. Then, are they better now than they were 10 years ago? Yeah. Are they reputable to actually doing a program to protect our groundwater resources? I don't believe so.
I've retired from oil.
So, Bill, did you have something you wanted to say?
It's Bill Alley again.
Okay.
The other player in the Central Valley has been the Regional Water Quality Control Board. I know one of their key staff persons sitting here in the audience, and they had 900 open ponds that wastewater is being disposed of in, about a third of which were unpermitted. And they are just now doing catch-up to about permitting all those, seeing what they're, and monitoring them where appropriate. If near groundwater, Clay would nod your head, right? So we're going to get more data from there too. And so it was a dual problem down there of not just injection, but surface water disposal. And we're getting a handle on that now too. I see it as an improving situation, and I have to trust the agencies and the data to some extent. So, Aliso Canyon.
If they have the funding for the monitoring programs and verification, I would like to see somebody go through and verify that the wells were injecting, the wells were producing, and where the water and the fluids were going. That's all. And that requires a model. But I say model makes it easy for everybody to understand, rather than, we'll get back to you later.
So this has been a really good discussion. I thought I'd interject here for a second in case there's the pregnant pause I was sensing. So, are there, pertinent to the policy question that's before us here, that what the law required us to do to review the definition, are there any, unresolved technical questions that folks want to address that maybe we haven't addressed fully yet that are, people want to talk about?
Hi, Catherine Morrison at Natural Resources and Water Committee. Just a question on the regional groundwater monitoring. The results have been pouring out the last couple of years. Has there been definitive, maybe definitive is too strong a word, but has there been some suggestion around the fields that you've been looking, observations of migration out of currently exempted aquifers of plumes? Not historic, but occurring right now during continuing operations.
Right, well, I'll answer that question this way. So there's priority areas that we're working with the USGS on with cooperation from the operators to collect data, and the USGS has gone into Dogger records as well. So their model that they use to pursue research is based upon multiple lines of evidence. So they'll look at electronic log data, they'll look at water quality data, they've collected data from wells adjacent to fields or within fields. Also, we've installed a couple of wells to the east of some of the Central Valley fields recently. And there's also been the collection of data, electromagnetic surveys that have been used. So that rigorous approach, looking at all of those, there's not just one piece of data that's used to say, yep, there it is. It's before the USGS comes to a conclusion on their studies, it's not just based upon an e-log, or it's not just based upon one water result or whatever. So there have been some preliminary findings in some of the fields where surface disposal of produced water has indicated that it's migrated out of where it's beneath the ponds. That's clear. There's a publication that's associated with that. There have been some review of electronic logs from wells that are used for injection that are in close proximity to fields that are showing that there's an increase in salinity in those wells in the what would be considered in a down gradient direction. So that's still one piece of it. That's a preliminary result. However, even though we've been around here for, it seems like forever, but it's only been about, 4 or 5 years, it takes a while to accumulate the data and to be able to assess it in a way where it's responsible and in a way where it makes scientific sense. So hopefully that answers your question. But it's not really pertinent to the question, though, that we're being asked today with respect to the review of the of that definition. And I think it's been a good discussion from what I heard. And to reiterate what Dan had said, I think the consensus is to leave at least the 10,000 milligrams per liter TDS portion of it, but it appeared that there were at least one presenter or commenter today that indicated that maybe an examination of areas where there was historical exemptions that there might need to be some additional scrutiny in those areas and potential for groundwater monitoring in those areas. Am I mischaracterizing anything? But I think that if there was a change, and what I said at the outset, if there's any type of proposed change, it's not going to happen today. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but that would happen under a public process. So there's a mechanism when the board adopted our model criteria, it gave the authority to our executive director to be able to make changes to the model criteria as need be. And I would imagine that would happen under the course of a public process, so people would have an opportunity to comment if there were any proposed changes to the model criteria. So we've been doing this for a number of years now, but I think that there's certainly another commitment that we made at the time of the adoption that we would have a somewhat of a review before the board on the status of the sampling at about the 5-year point or so. So it depends upon where 5 years is, who you talk to, but I would say it would be dependent upon when the sampling actually occurred and the analysis came back. So I think we're coming up pretty close to that time. So within the next year or so, there will be some sort of a public presentation at a board meeting, whether it be an informational item or otherwise, but there will be notice if there's any kind of a proposed change with respect to what we're talking about today as well.
Yeah, Brianna Morton from NRDC. I was just curious how you guys are actually interpreting that language. So the protected water language, so do you read it to mean that you're prohibited from monitoring in exempt aquifers, or just that it's not required? Like if you wanted to put a monitoring well in an exempt aquifer, do you think you could?
That's up to the operator. So if the operator wants to pursue a groundwater monitoring plan in an area that's exempt, I don't think we're going to reject that plan. However, they have an opportunity to request an exclusion from the requirement. And so we've had several requests for exclusions, we call them, in areas where it's in an historically exempt area. And oftentimes based upon a rigorous technical review, working with the operator, et cetera, we made a determination that we agreed and that there isn't a need to have a groundwater monitoring plan because it falls in line with what we had agreed to in the adoption. Well, I'm sensing a longer than normal pregnant pause, so I think it's our opportunity to sign off, maybe, unless someone has one last thing they'd like to say. We'll double check the emails here to make sure we don't have any last minute questions, Bill. But hearing none, we'll wanted to say thank you to everybody for participating today. Appreciate the talks, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.